When we think about Kate Middleton, we just think about the woman who is living a life out of a fairy tale. But what people do not know is the amount of suffering and hardship her parents had to face to bring her into this position. So get ready for a heartbreaking story of how the ladder of royalty is built. Spoiler alert, it's not a pretty sight. Before Kate Middleton ever stepped into a palace, before the cameras, before the titles, before the controlled smiles, there were two ordinary people quietly building a life that would later be torn open by public attention. Carol and Michael Middleton did not come from royalty, power, or protection. They came from work, from routine, from modest beginnings that demanded effort every single day. That foundation matters because it explains everything that followed, including the heartbreak. Carol Goldsmith grew up in a working-class household in London. Her father was a builder, and her mother worked part-time jobs to keep the family afloat. There was no inherited wealth, no safety net, no social leverage. What existed instead was ambition and an understanding that security had to be built manually, one decision at a time. That mentality shaped Carol early and would later drive every major choice she made as an adult. Michael Middleton's background looked more stable on paper, but it was not aristocratic privilege in the way tabloids would later imply. His family had connections to British industry and some distant aristocratic lineage, but his upbringing was still grounded in employment, expectations, and structure. Michael worked, studied, and lived within limits. He was not raised in luxury. He was raised to maintain stability. They met while working for British Airways. Both were employed in aviation roles that demanded discipline, long hours, and reliability. Their relationship formed in a space defined by schedules and responsibility rather than romance or spectacle. When they married in 1980, they were not chasing dreams of status. They were building a practical life based on employment and incremental progress. Their early married years were financially cautious. They lived within their means and saved carefully. Carol left her job after the birth of their first child, Catherine, and quickly noticed a gap in the market while organizing children's parties. Supplies were limited, ordering was inconvenient, and parents lacked cohesive options. This observation was not romantic, it was logistical. That detail matters because Party Pieces was born not out of indulgence, but out of problem-solving. In 1987, Carol launched Party Pieces from home. It was a mail-order business built slowly, without investors or headlines. Michael later joined full-time, leaving British Airways to support the company's expansion. This decision carried risk. Leaving a stable job for a family business meant everything rested on execution. For years, it worked. The company grew steadily throughout the 1990s and early 2000s. It expanded its catalog, improved distribution, and eventually moved into larger facilities. The children were involved informally, packing boxes and assisting during busy periods. The business paid for their education, including private schools and later university tuition. This is where public narratives begin to blur reality. The Middletons did not buy entry into elite spaces through inheritance. They paid for it through revenue. Every school fee, every tuition payment, every step up the ladder came directly from business income. That distinction would later be ignored by critics who preferred the word privilege over explanation. By the time Kate met Prince William at the University of St. Andrews, Party Pieces was profitable and stable. The Middletons were financially comfortable, but not untouchable. Their wealth was tied to the business. It was not diversified across estates or trusts. This dependency would later become a vulnerability. As Kate's relationship with William became public, the Middletons were pulled into a world they had never sought. Press interest increased. Their business was scrutinized. Their past was examined. Their social position was debated openly. For the first time, their personal choices were no longer private. Carol, in particular, became a lightning rod. She was framed alternately as ambitious, controlling, strategic, or calculating. None of these labels were supported by evidence. They were interpretations imposed on a woman who had built a company and wanted stability for her children. Still, the narrative stuck, and once it did, it never fully disappeared. Michael remained quieter, less visible, but the pressure affected him too. He was a man who valued privacy and routine, suddenly living adjacent to an institution that functioned on exposure and symbolism. The Middletons were expected to behave flawlessly while having no blueprint for what that meant. Despite this, the family maintained normalcy as long as possible. They did not seek media deals. They did not monetize access. They did not trade stories. Their restraint would later be forgotten when circumstances changed. This part of the story is not tragic because of loss. It is tragic because of fragility. Everything the Middletons had built depended on momentum, discretion, and balance. None of those survive well under a spotlight. The same work ethic that built their success left little margin for public error. By the time Kate married into the royal family in 2011, her parents were no longer just business owners. They were symbols. Expectations followed them everywhere. Any success was questioned. Any mistake was amplified. The safety of anonymity was gone permanently. What had once been a simple family story of effort and upward mobility was now frozen under scrutiny, waiting for stress to expose every crack. And stress was coming. By the time the world shifted, the Middletons were already carrying weight they never asked for. Party Pieces was no longer just a family business. It was a symbol attached to a future queen. That attachment changed how every success and every misstep was interpreted. What had once been ordinary commercial risk now carried reputational consequences. For years, Party Pieces relied on a predictable cycle. Seasonal demand, children's celebrations, school events, weddings, birthdays. The business model worked because people gathered. Orders came in advance. Stock moved consistently. Warehouses functioned on rhythm. That rhythm was fragile, even if it appeared stable. As online retail expanded, competition increased. Larger platforms undercut prices. Consumer behavior shifted toward convenience over curation. Party Pieces adapted slowly, adding new product lines and modernizing operations, but the core model remained vulnerable. It depended on physical events continuing uninterrupted. Then the pandemic arrived. Within weeks, events stopped. Parties were cancelled. Schools closed. Gatherings disappeared. The demand that sustained Party Pieces collapsed almost overnight. This was not a gradual downturn. It was an abrupt halt. Orders dried up. Stock sat unmoved. Fixed costs remained. Warehousing fees did not pause. Staff obligations did not vanish. Supplier invoices continued to arrive. For a business built on celebration, there was suddenly nothing to celebrate and no path to immediate recovery. Carol Middleton stepped back from day-to-day operations during this period, reportedly to focus on family responsibilities and health concerns. Leadership shifted internally, but the timing could not have been worse. The company needed decisive restructuring under conditions no one had prepared for. Instead, it entered survival mode. Losses accumulated quietly at first. Credit was extended. Payments were delayed. Hope rested on a post-pandemic rebound that never fully arrived. By the time restrictions lifted, consumer habits had changed permanently. Smaller parties replaced large ones. Disposable income tightened. Inflation crept in. Party Pieces attempted to recover. It adjusted inventory and sought investment. None of it was enough. The scale that once made the business profitable now worked against it. Overheads became anchors. What once felt manageable became crushing. In 2023, the company entered administration. The numbers told a harsh story. Debts exceeded £2.5 million. Creditors ranged from major institutions to small independent suppliers. One of the most widely reported creditors was a family-run business operated by Afghan refugees who supplied goods and were left unpaid. That detail spread quickly and hardened public opinion. The Middletons were accused of benefiting from royal proximity while leaving others to absorb losses. There was no evidence that they shielded assets or acted dishonestly. Still, perception overtook fact. The narrative shifted from misfortune to moral failure. Carol and Michael were not immune to this judgment. They faced the humiliation of seeing decades of work reduced to headlines about collapse and debt. Their business identity had been erased. Their personal integrity was questioned publicly. For Carol, the emotional toll was severe. Party Pieces was not just a company. It was her creation. It had grown alongside her children. Watching it fail publicly while being unable to defend herself created a sense of powerlessness that people around her reportedly noticed. Michael faced a different strain. As someone who valued structure and predictability, the chaos of administration proceedings and media speculation cut deeply. Every attempt to stay private was undermined by the company's association with the royal family. The sale of Party Pieces marked the end. It was sold for a fraction of its former valuation. What remained was not closure, but loss. Suppliers absorbed unpaid balances. Employees lost stability. The family lost control. Plans for future ventures were quietly abandoned, not because of lack of ideas, but because the cost of visibility had become too high. Any new project would be scrutinized through the same lens. The Middletons withdrew instead. What made this collapse particularly painful was its timing. Kate was navigating her own intense pressures within the royal family. Her parents' difficulties added emotional strain she could not publicly acknowledge. Support had to remain private. Distance had to be maintained. The Middletons retreated from public life further. Appearances became rare. Statements were minimal. Silence became the only viable defense. This silence, however, was interpreted by critics as avoidance rather than dignity. The tragedy of Part 2 lies not only in financial failure, but in exposure. A business that collapsed under extraordinary circumstances became a morality tale for an audience eager to assign blame. The Middletons became cautionary figures rather than people. This was not a story of greed or excess. It was a story of timing, dependency, and vulnerability. Their wealth was tied to one source. When that source failed, everything else followed. By the end of this chapter, the Middletons were no longer simply parents of a future queen. They were a family marked by loss, retreat, and the realization that success without insulation offers no protection when the ground shifts. And the scrutiny was not finished. The collapse of Party Pieces did not end with balance sheets or administration notices. It followed the Middletons home. What should have been a private reckoning became a public spectacle, and the consequences were not limited to finances. They became social, psychological, and deeply personal. Once the administration was announced, attention shifted rapidly from the company to the people behind it. Headlines hardened. Commentary lost nuance. Online discussion turned accusatory. The Middletons were no longer viewed as business owners caught in an unprecedented crisis. They were framed as symbols of excess, proximity, and entitlement, even though the evidence did not support that framing. The most damaging element was not national press coverage, but local reaction. In Bucklebury, the village where the Middletons had lived quietly for years, anonymous posters began appearing. These notices criticized the family and accused them of wrongdoing, tied to unpaid debts. The messaging was personal. It was not abstract criticism of corporate failure. It targeted them by name. For a family that had deliberately avoided public engagement, this marked a psychological turning point. Their privacy had been breached, not by paparazzi, but by neighbors. Familiar places became uncomfortable. Routine errands carried tension. Trust eroded. Carol Middleton, who had spent decades cultivating discretion, reportedly found this phase especially distressing. She had accepted business failure. What she struggled with was moral condemnation. The idea that her intentions were being questioned cut deeper than financial loss. She had built party pieces to provide stability, not spectacle. Now she was cast as the opposite. Michael Middleton reacted differently. He withdrew. Those close to the family described him as increasingly reserved, limiting social interaction and avoiding public settings altogether. This was not strategic silence, it was self-protection. Meanwhile, media narratives continued to escalate. Commentators questioned whether the Middletons had leveraged royal connections improperly. This claim persisted, despite a lack of evidence. No official complaints supported it. No investigations substantiated it. Still, the suspicion lingered because it fit an existing story people wanted to believe. That story was simple and damaging. Ordinary people rise too far, too fast, and fall because they do not belong. It ignored the years of work and the structural vulnerability of small to mid-sized businesses during global disruption. It focused instead on proximity to power. The timing worsened everything. Kate herself was navigating increasing strain within the royal institution. Her parents' crisis unfolded alongside her own pressure, limiting her ability to publicly support them. Any visible defense would have been interpreted as interference. Silence became mandatory, not optional. This separation carried emotional cost. The Middletons were accustomed to being a close family unit. Suddenly, emotional support had to be compartmentalized. Conversations became cautious. Stress was absorbed quietly, rather than shared openly. Public sympathy was limited. Many felt that association with royalty insulated the family from real consequences. That assumption was incorrect. The Middletons absorbed reputational damage without the protections afforded to actual royal households. They carried exposure without authority. As scrutiny continued, another layer of controversy resurfaced. Carol's brother, Gary Goldsmith, re-entered the public narrative. His past legal issues and public behavior became linked again to the Middleton name. Although unrelated to party pieces, his visibility reignited criticism. Gary's history included a conviction for assault and a reputation for volatile conduct. His decision to participate in reality television further complicated perceptions. Media coverage framed him as an extension of the family, despite limited involvement in their lives or business. This association frustrated the Middletons. They had spent years maintaining boundaries. Those boundaries collapsed under media simplification. individual actions were treated as collective responsibility. The emotional effect compounded. At a time when the family needed stability and privacy, they faced renewed exposure through a relative whose choices they could not control. The distinction between personal accountability and shared identity blurred completely. The Middletons did not respond publicly. They did not issue statements distancing themselves. They did not engage in image repair. This restraint was interpreted by critics as indifference. In reality, it reflected exhaustion and a belief that response would only prolong scrutiny. Internally, the family recalibrated. Social circles tightened. Appearances decreased. Life became smaller by necessity. This contraction was not defeat. It was survival. What makes this phase tragic is not hostility itself, but imbalance. The Middletons bore responsibility for a business failure in extraordinary circumstances, yet carried blame far beyond their actions. They faced public judgment without platform, defense, or resolution. Their story became a cautionary tale told without context. Few acknowledged the emotional weight of watching decades of effort dissolve while being told it was deserved. By the end of this period, the Middletons were changed, not broken, but altered. Trust in anonymity was gone. Confidence in fairness was shaken. The cost of visibility had been fully realized. By the time the noise faded, what remained was not resolution, but distance. The Middletons did not rebuild publicly. They did not attempt redemption arcs or explanations. Instead, they chose withdrawal, a decision shaped less by strategy and more by fatigue. Years of scrutiny had taught them that visibility no longer offered opportunity. It only invited interpretation. Their retreat was quiet but deliberate. Social appearances declined further. Public events were avoided. Long-standing routines were adjusted to reduce exposure. This was not isolation driven by shame. It was an attempt to reclaim control over a life that had been steadily stripped of boundaries. Carol Middleton, once described as energetic and relentlessly hands-on, slowed noticeably. Those familiar with her observed a shift from outward focus to inward protection. She had spent most of her adult life building something tangible. Now she faced the reality that building again would mean reopening wounds she could not afford to expose. Michael Middleton followed the same path. His response remained consistent. Reduce risk, preserve privacy, protect what remains. He had always valued stability over attention. The events of the previous years confirmed that instinct completely. The family dynamic adjusted accordingly. Conversations became practical rather than aspirational. The focus turned to health, well-being, and maintaining cohesion under pressure. The ambition that once defined the household was replaced by caution. This was not a failure of spirit. It was a recalibration forced by experience. Kate's role during this period was complex. As Princess of Wales, her public responsibilities expanded even as her parents' private world contracted. She could not acknowledge their struggle publicly. Any comment risked fueling speculation or appearing defensive. Support had to be offered behind closed doors. This separation created emotional strain. The Middletons were accustomed to being involved in their children's lives without filters. Now, distance was imposed by circumstance. Even proximity carried risk. Their presence could trigger commentary. Their absence could be misread. There was no neutral position. At the same time, broader narratives about class and belonging continued to circulate. The Middletons were often framed as outsiders who overreached. This framing ignored the reality that they had not attempted to enter royalty. Their daughter had. the distinction was rarely respected. This misunderstanding hardened into something quieter, but more enduring. The sense that effort is only celebrated until it challenges established hierarchies. Once that line is crossed, success becomes suspicious. Failure becomes instructive. The Middletons became an example used by others, a warning about aspiration, a reminder of perceived limits. This symbolic role was imposed, not chosen. It followed them regardless of their silence. Gary Goldsmith's continued public visibility added to the strain. Each appearance reopened associations the Middletons had tried to leave behind. They had no control over his choices, yet his actions continued to reflect back onto them. This dynamic reinforced a painful truth. Family ties do not dissolve under pressure. They become heavier. Despite everything, there was no public breakdown, no interviews, no grievances aired. This restraint prevented escalation but denied closure. The story never resolved because the Middletons refused to perform it. What remains tragic is not a single downfall, but accumulation. Years of work led to success. Success attracted attention. Attention stripped privacy. Crisis exposed vulnerability. Judgment followed without proportion. The Middletons did not lose everything. They retained family bonds. They retained dignity, but they lost the ability to live unnoticed. That loss cannot be quantified or recovered. Their story sits uncomfortably between worlds, too ordinary to be royal, too visible to be private, too restrained to defend themselves in a culture that rewards spectacle. In the end, there was no lesson offered by the family themselves, no statement about resilience, no narrative of reinvention, only continued absence. That absence is often misinterpreted as retreat. In reality, it is refusal. Refusal to allow personal pain to become public entertainment. Refusal to turn loss into content. Refusal to explain a life that was never meant to be observed this closely. This is where the story ends, not with reconciliation or redemption, but with quiet persistence. The Middletons continue forward, carrying experiences they never sought and consequences they did not anticipate. The tragedy lies not in collapse alone, but in what followed. The realization that once attention arrives, it never fully leaves, and that even the most careful lives can be undone simply by standing too close to history. This is not a royal story. It is a human one, and it remains unresolved because real lives rarely offer conclusions.